everybody, The Two for Life here, bringing you guys a brand new anime deck discussion. For those of you who don't know, this is a video series where I take a look at an anime deck and discuss whether or not if it should be printed, if it would make any difference in the meta, or if it would actually matter if it was printed. So, today we are looking at probably the most requested deck out there that people have been wanting Konami to print forever. I think the only other deck that I can think of that people have been wanting as much as this archetype is the armor archetype played by Phalon, and this is the fossil archetype. This is played by Jim Crook, if I remember right, from the Yu-Gi-Oh! GX anime. And it is a very weird deck in that it doesn't have very many monsters in the main deck. Heck, we've actually gotten one of its monsters printed in real life, Fossil Dyna, Fossil Dyna. And basically what this deck is focused around is this card right here, Fossil Fusion. Banish fusion materials that are listed on a Fossil Fusion monster card from your graveyard in your opponent's graveyard, and special summon that monster from your extra deck to special summon is treated as a fusion summon. So, what this deck is all about is summoning out these guys by using monsters in your graveyard and your opponent's graveyard as fusion material. Now, let's look at the monsters in the extra deck because they're the main ones, they're the main shows of they're the main stars of the show, and they are the main parts of this deck. You almost never have a non-fusion monster on your side of the field, except for whenever you wait for, except for the few times whenever you actually do summon out a monster. So, Fossil Machine Skull Buggy, Rock-type monster, one Rock-type monster plus any monster in your graveyard. One Rock-type monster in your graveyard and one monster in your opponent's graveyard. Kind of weird how, sorry, just misread it. You must use Fossil Fusions. Fusion summon this card, that's it for this guy's a level 4, 1400 attack. Cenozoic Fossil Knight Skullgar. One Rock-type monster in your graveyard plus one level 4 or lower monster in your opponent's graveyard. One Rock-type, okay, so this is Fossil Dragon Skullgar. One Rock-type monster in your graveyard plus one level 4 or lower Dinosaur-type monster in your opponent's graveyard. Fossil Machine Skull Wagon. One Rock-type monster in your graveyard plus one level 5 or 6 Machine-type monster in your opponent's graveyard. Here's the main one. Or at least the one that I remember that Gem used a lot in the anime. Fossil Warrior Skull Knight, one Rock-type monster in your graveyard plus one level 5 or 6 monster in your opponent's graveyard. At the end of the damage step, if your opponent controls another monster after this card attacks, this card can attack once more during this battle phase. You'll notice I'm skipping the first part because they all have the must be special summoned with Fossil Fusion, cannot be special summoned by other ways effect. Fossil Machine Skull Convoy. One Rock-type monster in your graveyard plus one level 7 or higher Machine-type monster in your opponent's graveyard. While your opponent controls a monster, this card can attack up to 3 times during each battle phase. When this card destroys a monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, inflict 1,000 damage to your opponent. Fossil Warrior Skulking. Awesome name. One Rock-type monster in your graveyard plus one level 7 or higher monster in your opponent's graveyard. Must be settled, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the damage step, if your opponent controls another monster after this card attacks, this card can attack once more during this battle phase. During battle between this card and attack, basically it does piercing. And then Paleozoic Fossil Dragon Skull Geoff. That is a mouthful of a name. One Rock-type monster in your graveyard plus one level 8 or higher monster in your opponent's graveyard. When this card attacks, you can target the attacking monster, switch its attack and defense during the damage step. Only during battle between this attacking card and a defense possessing monster, inflict piercing battle damage to your opponent. So, first and foremost, they all have very specific summoning conditions, with the exception of a few. Buggy requires any monster. Skullgar and Dragon Skullgar both require level 4 lower monster, but Dragon Skullgar specifies dinosaurs. Skull Wagon specifies it has to be a 5 or a 6 Machine-type monster. Fossil Warrior Skull Knight doesn't care about the typing, but it has to be a 5 or a 6. Skull Convoy needs a level 7 or higher Machine-type monster. Skull King needs a level 7 or higher monster in your opponent's graveyard, and Big Dinosaur Skull needs any level 8 or higher monster. So, just right off the bat, my biggest issue with this deck, okay, I actually have two big issues with this deck, is first and foremost, the fusion monsters, for as specific as they are, don't really have all that great attack and defense. Skullguard, which is the most easily to summon monster, only has, sorry, Skullbuggy, which is the most easy to summon monster, only has 1400 attack. Skullguard has 2000. Dragon Skullguard has 25. Skull Wagon has 17. Skull Knight has 24. Skull Convoy has 21. That's a level 8 fusion monster, guys. That has 2100 attack. Congrats, Konami. Fossil Warrior Skull King has 2800 attack, which actually is not bad for a level 8. And Skull Geoff has 3500, which is, again, not bad for a level 8 fusion monster. Actually, I think that's possibly one of the strongest level 8 fusion monsters I've ever seen. So, my biggest issue is that this deck is very specific in what it needs. Skullguard needs any level 4 lower monster. That's not harder to do. But, how many dinosaurs do you see? How many 5 or 6 machine-type monsters in your opponent's graveyards do you see that often? How about a 7 or higher? Or an 8 or higher monster? Nobody plays that high level monsters anymore these days. Unless it's a synchro monster. And even then, it's not going to be in the graveyard because your only way to really kill it is with Skull Gang or something. I mean, it's not guaranteed to be in the graveyard is what I mean. So, that is the biggest issue with this deck, is that it is so specific, okay? We have seen so many super specific fusion decks out there that just flop because they are so specific. Look at Retro Heroes. One of the biggest reasons that the original release of Heroes was really not all that great is because they were so specific. And these guys are even more specific because they rely on what your opponent's playing. Okay? That is really ridiculous. I mean, if you're dueling against a Dino deck, you're not going to be able to summon out Skull Wagon. And if you're dueling against a Wizard, Spellcaster deck, you're not going to use either Skullguard Dragon, or Skull Wagon, or Skull Convoy. That is just really crazy. And heck, now with pendulums that don't really ever hit the graveyard, it's going to be even harder because you must use monsters in your opponent's graveyard and one in your graveyard. That is just really hard to get through and everything. Now, with that being said, the deck is cool. I like the gimmick, okay? Being able to use a monster in your graveyard and a monster in your opponent's graveyard is pretty cool. Now, they all need a rock monster, so really, honestly, if this deck was released, I could totally see this being played on like Rockstone or something, because, again, the deck has like no main deck monsters. It has a total of 2, Fossil Dinos Pasiphelio and Sample Fossil. Fossil Tusker could be considered a part of the archetype, but he doesn't really, he was never played by Jim, so I didn't bother putting him in this. Now then, let's take a look at Sample Fossil. Question mark attack, I don't know, oh yeah, so, for a second I thought that was just a mistake. When this card is normal summon, you can target a level 4 or lower monster in your opponent's graveyard. Spell summon it to your side of the field. It cannot attack or be attributed. This card's attack is equal to that monster's original attack. So, what Sample Fossil is supposed to be used for is he's supposed to be able to, obviously, be fodder for Fossil Fusion, while also being a bit offensive whenever you obviously cannot use Fossil Fusion. And that is nice. He is able to copy the attack of any monster in your opponent's graveyard and summon it to your side of the field. The thing with that is that you don't want that monster on your side of the field. You want it in your opponent's graveyard so that you can use it as material for Fossil Fusion. So that's my only real issue with it. Also, you can't tribute it off or anything. And since you can't use Polymerization to fusion summon these guys because they must be summoned off of Fossil Fusion, that's really not all that great, sadly. Now then, Time Stream. This card is a little bit weird. Pay half your life points. Return 1 Cenozoic Fossil Knight or Mesozoic Fossil Knight. Fuse a monster on your side of the field to your fusion deck. That's all this card is. If a Cenozoic Fossil Knight monster was returned, special summon 1 Mesozoic Fossil Knight fusion monster from your fusion deck. If a Mesozoic Fossil Knight fusion monster was returned, special summon 1 Paleozoic Fossil Knight fusion monster from your fusion deck. This special summon is treated as a fusion summon. So I was a little bit confused whenever I first read this card because none of these guys was named Cenozoic or Mesozoic, with the exception of Cenozoic Fossil Knight Skullgar. And then I kind of put it together, and I figured that the other guy is this guy over here. So basically, you turn him into him or him into him, which is interesting, but it's not particularly great, especially since you're paying half of your life points. Granted, you can turn Skullgar into Skull Knight, which is really good because you're obviously increasing him by 300 attack, and he has a much better effect that Skullgar doesn't really even have an effect, really. But, however, it's still not all that great. You're paying half your life points to summon out a 2400 attack point monster that can attack twice. Okay, that was good back in the GX era, but nowadays that's not all that great. Next up is Fossil Hammer. Destroy the monster with the highest level your opponent controls, and if you do, your opponent chooses one monster from their graveyard with a lower level than the destroyed monster, and special summons it in attack position. This card I quite like. So since this deck is so heavily reliant on your opponent having monsters in the graveyard, they need ways to get them in the graveyard. So you activate this, destroy your opponent's highest level monster, which is presumably their strongest monster, and then your opponent gets summoned out a lower level monster, which will obviously be much weaker, and you can activate Fossil Fusion, use that high level monster, and possibly go for Skull GF, Skull King, or Skull Convoy, depending on what you're doing against, which is really nice. My only issue with that is that due to when this was released, it doesn't count for ranks. So if you're doing against someone like Heraldic Beast and they got nothing but freaking Xyz monsters up, this ain't going to do anything. So you're honestly possibly better off playing Visor at that point. Which, honestly, I can see this card still being good. Okay, it's just a matter of what you're doing against. Not only that, but also when you're dealing with pendulums, it's still an issue. So yeah, and then there's Living Fossil. Target one monster in graveyard, special summon it, and equip it with this card. It loses 1,000 attack, and its effects are negated. When this card is destroyed, the equipped monster is destroyed. This card is interesting, to say the least. So you target a monster in graveyard, special summon it, and equip it with this card. It loses 1,000 attack, and its effects are negated. It's kind of like a Call to Haunted, really. The only thing that I could see this being useful is for going for an Xyz plays and stuff like that. And my biggest issue with it is that it's useless when using the fusions, because they cannot be special summoned except by fusion summon by using Fossil Fusion. And even if you could summon them back, they have low attack power. You bring back freaking Skullgar, he's going to be 1,000 attack. Buggy, he's going to be 400 attack. Alright, the only one who would be relatively safe with the drop in attack power is Skull GF. He would drop down to 2,500. Okay, that is just really silly. Not to mention you want your monsters in your graveyard to be used for fusion summon with Fossil Fusion. Again, I don't know why you'd want to bring it back except for maybe going for an Xyz. And again, this is where I feel like that if this archetype was printed, okay, take out Fossil Dyna because that card's already printed. If all these cards were to be printed, they would most likely be played as like support for something like Rock Stun. Okay, they're all rocks. They're all earths. They fit with this deck theme so much. The only issue with that is that Fossil Fusion, it's not very what's the word I'm looking for? Synergetic with Rock Stun. Okay, so that's my biggest issue with that. Now, another issue I have again with the deck is the fact that the fusion monsters are very specific on what they need. Okay, I understand that some specifics are needed, but however, this guy needing a level 7 or higher fusion machine type monster in your opponent's graveyard. If Konami were to print this, they would really have to change around the specifics on these guys. Okay, Skullgar. Nobody plays dinosaurs anymore. They would have to change that around. They'd have to change around the machine type things. I mean, Wagon, they could maybe get by with leaving because of Cyber Dragons and some other decks. Another big thing is that a lot of these fusion monsters just flat out don't have an effect. Why doesn't Skullbuggy have the ability to attack directly? It has low enough attack, it should be able to attack directly. Skullgar should be able to, like, I don't know, pop a monster once per turn or something. He looks like he could do it. Why doesn't Skullgar have the ability to attack twice or something? All these fusion monsters should have an effect other than just how it can be summoned. And heck, the ones that do have effects, aside from Skull Geoff and Skull King and maybe Skull Convoy, they're not really all that great. I mean, yeah, sure, Skull Knight can attack twice if he kills a monster at the end of the damage step, but he's got 2400 attack. How often is that going to happen? Really, how often? And that is my biggest issue with this deck, is that the fusions are underwhelming, except for these two. These two are awesome, okay? These guys are underwhelming, and that's the majority of the deck. And it's because of this that if Konami were to print this, they would have to buff it. They'd have to take this deck, take it to the gym, steroid it to heck, and then just buff it even more. Like it needs buff out from Fallout. Like really, it needs like 10 canisters of those. It really does need to be buffed. Okay, so honestly, partly due to my just absolute love for fossils and dinosaurs, I'd love to see this archetype printed. Okay, not to mention it's one of the most highly requested anime archetype printed. I'm not joking about it. Anytime you see any kind of like anime deck discussion or anything, people are clamoring for this deck to be printed almost as much as the armor archetype, which I think is really cool. Like I remember when the Dragons of Legend sets were first coming out, everyone was like, "Oh my God, I hope we get fossils, or I hope we get armors." And I was really hoping, but no, Konami for some reason didn't give it to us. Hopefully, if we ever get a Dragons of Legend 3, we will see this deck printed. But however, I don't really have high hopes for it. Now, would this deck be able to do anything in the meta if it was printed? No. I'm going to say that right now. Just a flat out no. No, 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 no. Not unless they buff it like to the point where it is just so amazingly good. It's just a flat out no. Like, really. And it needs a way to search up Fossil Fusion. It needs a way to recur it back from a graveyard. It needs maybe another version of Fossil Fusion. And maybe a Fossil Fusion that allows you to use a monster from your graveyard and a monster in your opponent's extra deck that is face up. That would be really cool. And another issue with the deck is another reason why I don't think they'd be able to do well in like tournaments and stuff is because of this right here again. The specifics. Like who plays dinosaurs in today's age? Maybe back when Dino Rabbit was a thing, but that was forever ago. 5 or 6 machine type monsters that you don't see very often. 7 or higher machine type monsters, not often again. Heck, Skull King, maybe he'd be able to be summoned more often because if like Odd Eyes Pendulum Dragon ends up in a graveyard or something like that. This guy, I don't ever see being. I don't ever see him being summoned if he was printed with this exact same effect. Because nobody, like, unless you're doing against Galaxies or Blue Eyes or something like that, you will never see somebody playing a level 8 monster. Or maybe Gimmick Puppets. Okay, so Galaxies, Gimmick Puppets, Blue Eyes. That's it. That's all the rank 8 spam decks. That is, again, my biggest issue with this deck. And now I'm just kind of repeating myself. So, I like this deck a lot. I think it'd be fun, but I think it's really weak in the extra deck, and I think it could use a few more monsters in the main deck. Otherwise, you're just going to see this being played as an add-on to Rock Stun if it were to be printed. That is my biggest issue with it. Well, one of my biggest issues. I have a lot of issues with this deck. But again, my biggest issues with the deck is how specific the fusion monsters' requirements are, their crappy stats, their crappy effects, kind of, like these two are good, and their lack of support in the main deck. Okay, I feel like they have enough fusion monsters, maybe 1 or 2 more that have like good attack and good effects, but it's just the overall lacking of everything that makes this deck like. I'd be really hesitant to have it printed. Like, honestly. It's cool and everything, but if I had to choose between this deck and Armors to, like, fill up the last slots in, like, a Dragons of Legend 3 or something, I'd go with Armors. Just simply because it'd have a better chance of actually being a deck that could even possibly win. Like, I played around with this deck on YGL Pro, with the Rock Stun idea in it, and it was really hard winning, like, because you can't go into the big guys very often, and you're stuck with all these not very great fusions, and you end up having to rely on more of the rock stun part and everything. Um, Maybe I'm missing something. If there's like another rock deck out there that I just can't remember, I can't think of any other rock archetypes. Um, so guys, tell me what you're thinking about this deck. Do you think what do you think that Konami needs to do to make it good? What do you think Konami? Do you think Konami should print it? I again would really like to see it printed, but if I had to choose between this and armors, I'd go with the armors. As much as I love dinosaurs and fossils, this deck it is just lacking in so many different ways. Going off of the anime stuff alone, that I would much rather go with armors because that is a much more fleshed out deck than this. But however, hey, maybe if Konami does decide to print it, they could give it a few more extra support cards and maybe some that actually fit with the archetype. Like this is just silly. I know Jim played this. I remember him playing it. So yeah. So guys, thank you for watching. Tell me what you think about this deck. Do you think that what do you think that Konami needs to do to make it good if they were to print it? Thank you all for watching. Have a great day. Peace out, guys.